Good morning to all. Welcome to another section of this online class. So in the last class we discussed about the history of computers, evolution of computers, and also regarding the first generation computers. So in this class we will be dealing with the second generation computers onwards up to the fifth generation computers. So regarding the first generation computers, we discussed about the advantages and disadvantages of this first generation computers, and we discussed some major computers during that time, especially the ENIAC, EDSAC, and Mark I, etc., UNIVAC, etc. So today we will be continuing to the next generation of computer, which is the second generation of computers. So the second generation of computers is the period of this second generation computers is between 1957 to 1965. So it's a very short time period, and in this second generation computers, the major change while we comparing to the first generation computer is that in this generation, the second generation, they used the use of transistors. So the transistorized security or the circuits were used for this second generation computers, and especially the magnetic core and the magnetic drum storage devices were used to develop this type of computers. So these are the major changes while we looking upon the first generation computers to the second generation computers. So the major changes was the use of the basic elements. While in first generation computers they used the vacuum tubes, and here instead of vacuum tubes they used the transistors, and also they used the magnetical core in order to store the data, and it is regarded as the first form of data storage devices at that time. And the third point regarding the second generation computers is that the higher reliability of computers and large memory availability lead to the development of high level languages. So the languages, instead of using the binary languages, in this second generation they developed the use of high level languages. So for example, the high level language, for example, Fortran, COBOL, ALGOL, etc. And all these languages help to prepare the application programs, and it was much easier than before. So this is another important point while discussing the second generation computer. So first point is that the advent of the transistor use of the transistor, and the second point was the magnetic core and magnetic drum storage devices were used in this generation. Then the use of this higher level languages like Fortran, COBOL, and ALGOL, etc. And the fourth point is that the system programs called the compilers were developed to translate the high level language programs into corresponding executable machine language form. So there is another term which is termed as the compiler, and with the help of this compiler they developed a form of translating. So to translate the higher level language programs into corresponding executable machine language form. So with the help of these compilers they developed a translating process in which they translated the high level language programs into machine level language programs. So this was another important point regarding the second generation computer. And the next point is that the separate use of processors, especially the input and output processors, and it helped to run as a parallel to the central processor that executed the programs, thus improving the overall performance. So we all know that the central processing unit is the major processor which is used in a computer, and beside that they developed in the second generation computers, the inventors developed another two form of processors. They are regarded as the input and output form of processors, and it helped to run parallel to this central processing unit, in which it helped to improving the overall performance. So the overall performance of these computers were increased while we compare to the first generation computer. And the next point is that the IBM, we already discussed the IBM in the last class, and today the IBM became the major computer manufacturer during this time. So the IBM became the Hollerith company later developed as the IBM, and this IBM became the major computer manufacturer during this time. So this was another advancement in this second generation computers. And we while connecting with this first generation computers, we can say that the basic component was a discrete entity. So the discrete entity means it used a separate entity in the second generation computer. So we already discussed that in the first generation computers they used the basic elements such as the vacuum tubes as the major element in which to develop the computers, and here they used instead of these vacuum tubes they used the transistors or the circuits which is basically made upon these transistors. So it was another major difference between while comparing to the first generation computer. Then the many thousands of individual components had to assembled by hand into functioning circuits. So this was another drawback in which they have to make all these circuits in order to run this computer. So this was another drawback of this second generation computer. And also the manual assembly of individual components and the cost of labor involved at this assembly stage made commercial production of these computers difficult and costly. So all these circuits, all these parts were manually assembled, and this was one of the major drawback of this second generation computer, in which it was more difficult, and also all these computers under this category in the second generation category were costly because of this all operations such as the manual form of assembly of this circuits and all other parts of these computers were very costly. So it was another major drawback of this second generation computer. So we discussed about the major points regarding the second generation computer. Firstly, we discussed about the basic element, which is the transistors, which is used in this second generation computers. Secondly, we discussed about the magnetic and magnetic drum storage devices, which helped very simple or very helped the computer generation, this second computer generation, in a very helpful manner, in which it was widely used at that time. And the higher reliability of these languages, especially the use of these higher level languages like Fortran, COBOL and Algol, etc., used in this second generation computer, in which to prepare the application programs much easier. And the another point was that to use these higher level languages, they used a form of things which is regarded as the compilers, and it is regarded as the system programs. So these, with the help of these system programs, with the help of these compilers, they executed these higher level languages into machine level languages. So this was another important thing regarding this second generation computer. And the second last point was the use of these input output processors, which run parallel to this central processing unit. And also the IBM, regarding the IBM, it became the major computer manufacturer during this time. So this is regarding the major points while discussing the second generation computer. Now we can discuss the major advantages of these second generation computers. So firstly, the size, regarding the size, the smaller in size as compared to the first generation computers. So all the computers under this second generation computers were smaller in size only while comparing to the first generation computers, in which the first generation computers were bulky in size. So it was major drawback of first generation computers. And the second point is that these computers were more reliable. So it is another major advantage of this second generation computers, more reliable. And the third point is that the lower power consumption, and it also helped the running cost. So the lower power consumption means the energy consumed to run these computers were decreased or reduced while comparing to the first generation computers. So the major advantage of this lowering this power consumption is that the running cost was reduced, and the another point is that the higher operating speed. So this is another major advantage of this second generation computer, in which the operating speed was increased, and also it helped to computational time, and it reduced the milliseconds to the microseconds. So the time was reduced in such a way that all the calculations were in the first generation, up to the first generation computers, were in milliseconds. So from here onwards, all these time calculations in computers were reduced into microseconds. So it means the speed of these computers were increased. And also another point is that less prone to hardware failures. So the hardware failures were reduced, and it also is a main advantage of this second generation computers, in which the maintenance cost was reduced also with the help of this hardware failures, less amount of this hardware failures. And the another point is that the better portability. So some of these computers were portable in size, so it was another important thing while discussing the second generation computer. And lastly, it reduced the manufacturing cost and hence the wider commercial use. So the manufacturing cost was reduced only while comparing to the first generation computers, and it helped to use in a very broad manner or in a wider manner, especially for the commercial use. So these are the major advantages of these second generation computers. Basically the size was reduced, smaller in size, then more reliable. Then we discussed about the lower power consumption. It helped to run in a very feasible manner. Running cost was reduced. Then the higher operating speed, and it also helped to improve the speed, and it changed milliseconds to microseconds, the running time of these computers, the computational time of these computers. Then the less prone to hardware failures. So the hardware failures were reduced while comparing to the first generation computers. And the second last point was that the better portability. And lastly, we discussed about the reduced manufacturing cost of these computers. So these are the major advantages of this second generation computers. And we have some drawbacks or disadvantages of these computers have. So they are the air conditioning was required. So this is one of the major disadvantages of these computers. We also discussed it in the first generation computers also. So the air conditioning was required in order to reduce this heat, because all these processes have some amount of heat energy. It exhausted some heat energy. So in order to reduce this heat form, the air conditioning was necessary. So this was another disadvantages. Then the frequent maintenance was required. Also the size was reduced and the hardware failures was decreased. The frequent maintenance was required. It means the maintenance at the regular intervals. Then the another important disadvantage of these computers were the manual integration of the individual components into functional units was required. So the use of these individual components into functional units, all these changes, all these integrations was manual. So it was another important thing in which to operate all these components, a manual form of energy or manual form of integration was required. So it was very another disadvantage of these second generation computers. And lastly, the commercial production was difficult and costly. Although all the size, then the reliable and also the power consumption and the hardware failure, all these things were reduced, and also the commercial production was still difficult and it also costly. So these are the major disadvantages of this second generation computers. Mainly the air conditions were required, then the frequent maintenance was required, then the manual integration of this use of these components was very necessary. Then lastly we discussed about the commercial production. It was very difficult and costly. So this is regarding the second generation computers. Now we are moving to the third generation computers. So the period between the third generation computers were available is that 1965 to 1975. So a year of 10 years, a span of 10 years was the third generation computers, and in which during this time the integrated circuits, especially the transistors, resistors and the capacitors were come into another form of thing, which is the piece of silicon. So in this generation, in this third generation, the use of this silicon was introduced. So this was another major advancement of this third generation computers. So in the first generation computers, we discussed about the thermonic tubes, which is the vacuum tubes, and in the second generation computers, we discussed about the transistors, the circuits which is made up of these transistors, and in this third generation, they use a form of piece of the silicon, which is the integration of all these things, which includes the transistors, resistors, and capacitors. So this means that it reduced the price and size of computers, and it adding to a general trend in the computer industry of manufacturing. So it means that the size and also the price of computers were reduced with the help of using this silicon. So it is the form of, we can say that the first form of this IC or the integrated circuit boards was from this third generation onwards. They developed the form of this integrated circuit forms. It is only the first form. It is not recognized as the first major form at that time. Only a use of a piece of silicon in the third generation. So regarding this third generation computers, the piece of silicon, a silicon piece was used to make these computers. And also in 1960, the Digital Equipment Corporation introduced the Program Data Processor, which is regarded as the PDP-1. PDP means the Programmed Data Processor, PDP-1, which can be called the first mini computer due to its relatively the smaller size. So the first mini computer was developed during this in between the second generation and third generation. In 1960, the Digital Equipment Corporation introduced this mini computer, which is regarded as the PDP-1, and it also why it called as this mini computer is because it was relatively smaller in size. So it is another major advancement of that age, in which they developed or they introduced the computers comparatively smaller in size while compared to the second generation computers and also the first generation computers. Then another important point in this generation is that the third generation computer, because of this very built and the cost of this all these processors were, or especially the PDP was little bit costlier. The PDP was also PDP-1 was also the computer that ran the very first video game called the Space War, written in 1962. So with the help of this PDP-1 or the first mini computer, at that time they introduced a form of computer game which is regarded as the Space War. So it is the first video game regarded as the first video game. I repeat, the Space War, which is which is introduced in 1962. So this was another major advancement in the third generation computers. Firstly, they used the silicon piece of materials or the elements as the basic element to introduce these computers. Secondly, the Digital Equipment Corporation introduced the first mini computer, which is based on this Programmed Data Processor PDP-1, and then they introduced the first video game, which is the Space War in 1962. Then thirdly, we can say that the software industry came into existence in the mid of 1970s as companies formed to write the programs that would satisfy the increasing number of computers users. So at that time, the softwares began to develop, or the form of softwares were introduced in order to use or in order to satisfy the users of computers, and also it helped in the business, government, military, and also in the educational environment. So the development or the advancement of these all these softwares which introduced at that time helped in the government sector and also in education sector, and also it was used for the business and the military purpose too. And because of this target market, which is we discussed earlier, which is the government, educational, and military, and also the business sector, all these target market recognized as the target market the first software companies mostly offered the accounting and statistical programs. So the business-minded programs were developed at the first form of while developing the softwares, in which the accounting and also the statistic form of softwares were used or developed during that time. And this time period also had the first set of computing standards created for compatibility between systems. So all the development or the advancement also issued some form of compatibility. So it also resolved during this time, and the computing standards they created for compatibility between the systems. So all the softwares, all the programs were compatible to all the operating systems or all the computers developed during that time. And the email originated some time between the 1961 and 1966. So during that time, the email, which is regarded as the electronic mail, was introduced or originated during that time, and it allowed the computer users to send the messages to each other, and as long as they were connected through a network. So we all know that we are currently using the all form of the emails and all social media in order to connect with other peoples. So with the help of this email at that time in 1961 onwards, they connected between the computers with the help of these emails, and before all that the network was introduced, and with the help of this network connection they connected between the people with the help of these emails. Then all these things closely tied to the work that and all the form of this advancement mainly introduced another form of internet, which is the Advanced Research Project Agency Network, and it is also called as the Arpanet. So the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, it is regarded as the Arpanet, and it was the networking technology and innovation that would one day bring the internet. So it was the first form of the internet in which it helped to connect the computers in a very systematic manner, very advanced manner. So the Arpanet, which is very important while studying the third generation computers, the Arpanet was introduced during the time of this third generation computers. So these are the major points while discussing the third generation computers. So in the third generation computers we have some advantages and disadvantages too. So basically the advantages are more in number while compared to the disadvantages. So the first advantage of this third generation computers is that the smaller in size as compared to the previous generation of computers. So in this generation also the size was reduced of all these computers. So it was a major another advantage of this third generation computers, and also more reliable and while compared to the second generation computers. So the first point was that about the size, which is smaller in size. Second point is that the more reliable while compared to the second generation computers, and lower heat generated. So the heat generation was reduced in these third generation computers, and also the computational time reduced from microseconds to nanoseconds. So it was another major advancement, the computational time in which it reduced from microseconds into nanoseconds. So it is another major change. And the next point is that the maintenance cost is low because of the hardware failures are rare. So the cost of maintenance was reduced only because of this hardware failures was also reduced, because all the advancement was basically helped in this mainly the maintenance cost was reduced, and also the computational time was also reduced from microseconds to nanoseconds. So these are the another major important points. Then the next point is that easily portable. All these computers were easily portable, and totally the general purpose was the use of all these computers, and it is also widely used for the various commercial applications all over the world. So all these computers helped, which comes under this third generation computers, it helped to run the commercial applications in which it helped for the business as the accounting softwares or programs, and also for the government, military and educational sections, in which all over the world it helped to use as a general purpose computers. computers. Then another important point is that lesser power requirement and while compared to the previous generation computers, and the manual integration was not required. So this was another major advancement while we compare to the second generation computer, in which the manual integration was not required in this third generation computer. Then the commercial production was easier and cheaper. So the production or the commercial form of production, manufacturing production, or the cost was reduced and it was easier, and we can say that the commercial production was easier and cheaper. Then these are the major advantages of these third generation computers. Basically, firstly we discussed the size, which is smaller in size. Then we discussed the reliability, which is more reliable than the second generation computers. Then the heat, which is low heat generator. Then the computational time, which is reduced to microseconds into nanoseconds. Then the maintenance cost was also reduced. Then the portability, easily portable computers were, the third generation computers were recognized as the easily portable computers. Then the general purpose, the use of these programs, system programs, applications in the computers, and it is used all over the world as a totally general purpose computers. Then the manual integration was not required, and also the commercial production was easier and cheaper. So these are the major advancement or the major advantages of these third generation computers. And we have only two disadvantages of this computer. The third generation computers have only just two disadvantages. They are, firstly, the air conditioning. It was required in many cases in these computers too, and also the higher sophisticated technology required for the manufacture of IC chips. So in the introduction part I discussed about the silicon pieces. So it was the first early form of these IC chips, and in order to develop or in order to manufacture this form of IC chips, it was very highly sophisticated technology required, and it was also very difficult to manufacture all these form of these IC chips while we discussing the third generation computers. So all these are the major disadvantages of these third generation computers. So I repeat, in this third generation computers we discussed about the major change, basically the use of this piece of silicon and the early form of these IC chips. Then we discussed about the price and size, which is reduced, and in which the form of processor, which is the programmed data processor 1, PDP-1, was introduced during this time, 1960s time, and it is also called as the first mini computer. And also another important thing is that a video game was introduced, and it is regarded as the first video game. It is called as the Space War in 1962. Then the software industry was advanced in such a way that they developed the softwares for all the general purposes, such as the government sector, education sector, military sector, and also for the business sector, such as the accounting softwares, etc. And it also helped to use the computers more easier and reduced the time to process the data. Then the use of these emails, which is originated during this time between 1961 to 1966, and it allowed the computer users to connect with others with the help of this internet. And the first form of this major internet is called as the Arpanet, which is regarded as the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. And this Arpanet was the networking technology was introduced during this time, the time of this third generation computers. And also we discussed some advantages of these computers, which includes the size, smaller in size, and a reliable lower heat generator, and the maintenance cost was reduced, and also the computational time was reduced into nanoseconds, and the manual integration was not required, as such all the advantages of these things. And also some major two drawbacks of these third generation computers, which includes the use of the air conditioning conditioning and also the use of the higher sophisticated technology was very difficult in order to manufacture the IC chips. So these are the major points while discussing the third generation computers. So we are moving to the next generation of computers, which is regarded as the fourth generation of computers. So the fourth generation computing or the fourth generation of computers spanned from 1975 to 1985. So the other 10 years after the third generation computers was regarded as the fourth generation computers. So the time period was 1975 to 1985. And this time the computer technology was advanced, and also the computer could fit in something the size of the typewriter. So the size was reduced into a form of the basic form of a typewriter. So it was major advancement of this fourth generation computers. And this form of computers were, or the introduction of this form of size reduced form of computers is regarded as the they are regarded as the microcomputers, and the first form of this microcomputer is the Altair 8800 or 8800, and this Altair 8800 was the first microcomputer of the present age, in which the fourth generation from 1975 to 1985, and the invention or the advancement of this Altair 8800 was debuted in 1975, and it was a major advancement, and it was advanced or developed as a mail order hobby kit, and many people acknowledge this Altair 8800 as the computer that sparked the modern computer revolution, especially since the Bill Gates and the Paul Allen founded the Microsoft with a programming language called the Altair Basic. So the Altair Basic was one of the computer language which was developed by Bill Gates and the Paul Allen, who founded the Microsoft company, and they introduced the programming language with the help of this microcomputer, which is the Altair 8800. So while discussing the fourth generation computer, the major advancement is that the introduction to this microcomputers. So in the third generation we discussed about the mini computers. So here we have the microcomputers, which is the Altair 8800. Then the use of this programmed language, which is developed by Bill Gates and Paul Allen, which is the Altair Basic, it made specifically for the this microcomputer, which is the 8800, and now the computers could fit on desk, that they become much more common. So today we have more form of these programmed languages in order to develop or in order to use the computers in a very systematic manner, and it also helped to develop the operating systems in a very advanced manner. So the Microsoft company introduced this programming language, which is used as the regarded as the Altair Basic, and this Altair Basic language, which is the programming language, was used in this Altair 8800 microcomputer. So this was the first part of this first fourth generation computer. And secondly, we have the another major company, which is the Apple computer, and this company was called as a very small computing agency, and it was established in 1976 by, and single-handedly changed to the industry forever. So it was major, we can call it as a form of advancement rather than it was a form of revolution in which the Apple computers were developed, or the growth of Apple computers were very important in this stage, in which they introduced many form of short form of these computers during this time. And the Steve Wozniak and also the Steve Jobs, who regarded as the form of founders of these Apple computers, and they introduced the Apple I computer in the 1976, and it quickly gained popularity. So the introduction to this Apple I, the first computers which was developed from the company which is the Apple company, was very popular during that time, time in 1976. So the Apple I was introduced during the 1976, and it quickly gained the popularity. And it came with a keyboard and only required a monitor to be plugged into a back of the system, and it also a novel idea for computers at that time. So the Apple I, or the form of first computers from the Apple company, the Apple I was one of the major advancement of the computers all of that time, in which the Apple company introduced the use of these keyboards, and also only thing to use the computer was that for external use of a monitor. So a monitor was used in order to use this Apple I computer. So we discussed the major two advancement during this time. Basically, firstly we discussed about the Altair 8800, which is regarded as the first form of the microcomputer. Then we discussed about the programming language which was developed by the Steve Jobs and the Paul Allen, and the name of this programmed language was the Altair Basic, and this Altair Basic was used in this Altair 8800 computer. Then in 1976 the Apple company introduced the Apple I. It was introduced by the Steve Jobs and also the Steve Wozniak. So these two intellectuals introduced these computers in a very innovative manner, in which they introduced the use of the keyboards, and also only thing that required to run these computers was a monitor, and it was also a successful during that time. And then they introduced or released the Apple II in the next year, which is in 1977, and was the first mass produced microcomputer to the commercially sold, and also it used as a personal form of computing. So the Apple II, which is introduced after the introduction of this Apple I, in 1977 the Apple company introduced their second computer, which is called as the Apple II, and this computer is very advanced in all its functions, and it is also helpful for the area of personal computing. So the idea of this personal computing was developed or introduced with the introduction to this Apple II computer. And then in 1981 the micro disk operating system, which is regarded as the MS-DOS. So this micro disk operating system was released to run the Intel 8086 microprocessor. So the major first form of this microprocessor was made by Intel company, and the name of this microprocessor is the Intel 8086 or 8086 microprocessor, and it used the operating system, which is the MS-DOS, and we can call it as the Microsoft disk operating system. So the Microsoft then developed this operating system, and they linked with this company, which is the microprocessor company Intel, in order to develop another form of computers. And this use of this microprocessor, which is Intel 8086, was one of the major advancements during that time in 1981. And over the next few years the MS-DOS became the most popular operating system in the world, eventually leading to the Microsoft Windows 1.0, which is released in 1985. So the earliest form or the first form of this Microsoft Windows, which is commonly used in today, was in 1981, in which it is regarded as the MS-DOS and developed by the Microsoft company, and it was one of the most popular operating system during that time. And the Microsoft Windows 1.0 was released in 1985, and also after it was just a competition between these companies, especially the Microsoft company and also the Apple company. And the Apple company in 1984 introduced the Mac OS, which was the first operating system to be completely graphical. So the Apple company introduced the operating system in 1984, which is the Mac OS, and it the major advantages or major advancement of this Mac OS is that it was completely graphical. Then both Mac OS and the Windows used the pull down menus, icons and windows to make the computing more user friendly. So all these operating systems developed by Microsoft and the Apple company, they introduced all these operating systems in order to make all the computing processes more user friendly. Then the computers were now being controlled with a mouse as well as a keyboard, and the first mouse was developed in 1981 by Xerox. So the Xerox company introduced the first form of the mouse, which is used until today. So the advancement of all these things, in which using the use of the keyboard, we already discussed about the use of keyboard, and here in 1981 the Xerox company developed the mouse, which is the first mouse developed during that time. Then the software, regarding the software, it was became much more common and diverse during this period with the development of spreadsheets, then the databases and the drawing programs. So all the softwares was categorized into the use in such a way that they are categorized as in a spreadsheet manner or database manner and drawing programs, all these things. And the softwares became more popular during that time, in which it became more user friendly too. So the computer networks and email became much more prevalent as well. So the use of the computer network and also the email became more popular during that time too. Then the first truly portable computer, which is called as the Osborne 1, which was released in 1981, and this is regarded as the first form of the portable computer, which is the Osborne 1. And the portable computers like the TRS-80 model 100 or the 101 and 2 and the IBM 5155 followed the afterward. So all these things were introduced after the introduction to the first portable computer, which is Osborne 1. So later they released the portable computers like TRS-80 model 100 and 102, and also the IBM, which was we already discussed about the IBM company. They also introduced a form of the portable computer, which is IBM 5155, which is also a popular computer during that time. So all these computers were introduced during the 1980s in order to and the basic advancement is that all these computers were portable. So this is regarding the major part of the fourth generation computers. We have some more points in this fourth generation computers and also some advantages and disadvantages too. So today we discussed about this major points regarding the second generation computers, then third generation computers and fourth generation computers. So regarding this fourth generation computers, the first point we discussed about this fourth generation computers is that the size of computers was reduced to a form of the size of just like a typewriter, and the first microcomputer was developed during this time, which is the Altair 8800, and also in 1975 these computers were launched, and later the Microsoft company introduced the Altair Basic, which is a programmable language which is used in this computer, Altair 8800. Then later another company, Apple company was introduced. They introduced Apple I computer, and it gained popularity, and it used the first form of keyboards. And in 1976 they introduced this Apple I computer, and later they also introduced the Apple II computer, and it was regarded as the most popular computer, which is particularly because of this personal used computer. So personal computing was easier with the help of this Apple II computer. So later in 1981 the Microsoft Disk Operating System MS-DOS was developed, and with the help of this Intel 8086 microprocessor, and this MS-DOS was one of the major first popular operating system during that time. Later they developed, the Microsoft company developed the Microsoft Windows 1.0, which is released in 1985, and in 1984 the Apple introduced their Mac OS, which was the first operating system to be completely graphical. And then the Xerox, the first mouse, was introduced in 1981, and the softwares were introduced according to the use, especially for the spreadsheets, databases, and drawing programs, etc. Later, the first form of the portable computers were also developed. The first truly portable computers was the Osborne 1, and it was released in 1981. So these are the major points why we discussed in these fourth generation computers. So today we discussed the second generation computer, then the third generation computer, and also lastly we discussed the major part of this fourth generation computers too. So in the next class we discuss the another points in this fourth generation computers, and we have another important topic, which is the fifth generation computers too. So all these points we discuss in the next class. So today we discussed all these points. So go through the textbook. You can see all these points in a systematic manner in the textbook. So read the textbook, and if you have any doubts, you can ask me while we are discussing all these topics. So thank you for today. We will meet until the next class. Thank you. Happy learning.